The wind screamed through the frozen mountains as if the forest itself was warning everyone to stay away. Snow covered the ground like a white grave, and the river beneath the ice roared with terrifying force. Then, through the storm, a soft cry echoed across the silence. It was not the cry of a human. It was the desperate whimper of a tiny wolf cub fighting for his last breath. Everyone else walked away. But one forgotten Omega girl stopped. She had no power, no family, and no place in her cruel pack. Yet she risked her own life, crawling onto cracking ice with bleeding hands to save a helpless little wolf she believed was nothing more than an abandoned cub. She had no idea that the tiny life wrapped inside her worn cloak was the missing heir to the most powerful alpha king alive. Now the entire kingdom is hunting for him. The deadliest assassins are closing in. A ruthless Luna wants the child erased forever. And when the alpha king finally finds the woman holding his son, he believes she is the kidnapper. But before this story reaches its heartbreaking ending, one rejected Omega will stand where no Omega has ever dared. And she will change the fate of an entire kingdom forever. If you'd like an even more viral opening, I can also write a Mr. Ballin style, Netflix cinematic or dramatize me style hook. Elara pulled her thin cloak tighter as the winter wind howled through the silent forest. Snow covered every tree and every stone until the world looked like a place forgotten by time. Her hands were already numb, but she kept walking because the pack healer had ordered her to gather frost herbs before sunset. No one cared that the storm was growing stronger. No one cared that an Omega could freeze to death alone. If she returned without the herbs, she would be punished again. So she lowered her head and pushed through the deep snow while icy air burned her lungs with every breath. The forest seemed strangely quiet. Even the birds had disappeared from the frozen branches. Elara stopped for a moment when she heard a faint sound carried by the wind. At first she believed it was only the storm playing tricks on her mind. Then the sound came again. It was small, weak, and filled with pain. It sounded like a tiny animal begging for help. She slowly turned toward the frozen river where thick sheets of ice covered the rushing water below. The cry came once more, and this time there was no mistake. Something was trapped. Without thinking about the danger, Elara hurried across the snowy bank until she reached a pile of broken rocks resting on cracked ice. Beneath the heavy stones she spotted a tiny white paw shaking against the cold. A frightened little wolf cub was trapped under the frozen rubble. His silver-blue eyes were filled with fear and exhaustion. His breathing was weak, and every small cry became quieter than the last. Elara dropped to her knees and whispered softly that everything would be all right, even though she had no idea if she was strong enough to save him. The sharp edges of the frozen rocks cut deep into Elara's hands as she pushed with every bit of strength she had. Blood stained the white snow, but she refused to stop. The tiny cub looked at her with frightened eyes that slowly began to close. Every second felt heavier than the last. She prayed quietly that she would not be too late. After one final effort, the largest stone rolled away, and the little wolf slipped free from the icy trap. His small body trembled violently from the cold. Elara quickly wrapped him inside her worn cloak and held him close against her chest, hoping her own warmth could keep his heart beating. The cub gave one weak lick against her cheek before losing consciousness. Tears filled Elara's eyes because she knew he had trusted her without fear. Far beyond the frozen mountains, a great fortress stood beneath dark clouds. Inside the royal hall, silence filled the air as armored warriors knelt before the mighty Alpha King Kael. His piercing silver eyes remained fixed on the blood-stained blanket lying across the floor. It had belonged to his only son, Prince Orion. The captain lowered his head and delivered the words no father ever wished to hear. The prince had vanished during an attack, and every trail had disappeared beneath the storm. No body had been found, but hope was fading with every passing hour. Kael closed his eyes only for a moment before rising from his throne. His voice echoed through the hall with calm, terrifying power as he ordered every royal warrior to search every forest, every mountain, and every village until the child was found. Hidden among the snow-covered trees, a dark-cloaked figure watched Elara carry the tiny cub away. A cruel smile appeared beneath the stranger hood. The child had survived, and now someone else knew exactly where the lost royal heir had gone. The hunt had only just begun. Morning arrived beneath a sky covered with gray clouds, but little warmth reached the small village. Elara quietly slipped inside through the back path, hoping no one would notice the bundle hidden beneath her cloak. She hurried into the tiny storage shed where she slept on a bed made from old blankets and broken straw. The room was cold and empty, but it was the only place where no one wanted to enter. She carefully placed the little white cub beside the small fire she managed to light with dry sticks. His breathing had become steadier, but he was still weak from the freezing river. Elara searched through her small collection of herbs and crushed healing leaves into a soft paste before gently spreading it across the cuts on his tiny body. The cub flinched for a moment, then relaxed when he heard her soft voice. She smiled with quiet relief because he was still fighting to live. Outside, the shed life continued as if nothing had happened. Other pack members walked past without looking toward her home. To them, Elara was invisible unless someone needed extra work done. She fetched water, cleaned floors, carried heavy baskets, and accepted cruel words without complaint. The Luna often called her useless in front of everyone, while younger wolves laughed because they believed kindness was weakness. Even the other Omegas kept their distance, fearing they would be punished for showing her friendship. Elara had grown used to the loneliness, but every insult still left a quiet ache inside her heart. When night finally returned, she carried a small bowl of warm broth back to her room. She drank only a few careful sips before placing the rest beside the tiny cub. Though hungry herself, she gently lifted his head and helped him drink. His bright eyes slowly opened, and for the first time they met hers with trust instead of fear. A tiny wag of his tail filled the silent room with hope. The days passed slowly as snow continued falling over the quiet village. Each morning Elara left before sunrise to finish the hardest work, while the tiny white cub remained hidden inside her little room. Every evening she hurried back with scraps of food tucked beneath her cloak. Sometimes it was only a small piece of bread or a few bits of dried meat, but she always gave the larger share to the cub. Though her own stomach ached with hunger, she smiled whenever she watched him eat. His strength returned little by little, and soon he could stand on his tiny paws. He followed her around the room with playful steps and rested beside her whenever she sat down. For the first time in many years, laughter quietly returned to Elara's lonely life. One peaceful night, the little cub curled beside her as she gently brushed the snow from his soft white fur. As her fingers passed across his shoulder, a strange silver mark, hidden beneath the thick fur, began to glow with a faint light. The mark shone only for a few heartbeats before fading again. Elara stared in surprise, believing her tired eyes had imagined it. She whispered that perhaps the moon itself was watching over him, then wrapped him warmly inside her blanket. She never guessed the glowing mark was the ancient royal crest carried only by the bloodline of the Alpha Kings. Far beyond the village, the dark-cloaked hunters followed faint tracks through the frozen forest. One of them knelt beside a small white hare caught on a broken branch. He smiled without warmth as he held it toward the moonlight. The scent was fresh and unmistakable. Their leader quietly ordered the group toward the nearby village where the trail ended. Before the first light of dawn touched the mountains, silent shadows surrounded the sleeping homes, and the hunters prepared to search every single door. Before the first light of dawn reached the village, Elara woke to the sound of heavy footsteps outside her small room. The tiny white cub lifted his head at once, and his ears twitched toward the door. A low, frightened whimper escaped his throat. Elara gently placed a finger against her lips, asking him to stay quiet. She slowly looked through a narrow crack in the wooden wall, and saw dark-cloaked warriors moving from house to house. Their faces were hidden beneath black hoods, and each one carried a long sword across his back. They spoke very little, but every movement showed they were searching for someone important. Fear settled deep inside Elara's heart because strangers never entered their isolated village without reason. She quickly lifted a loose wooden board from the floor and revealed a small empty space beneath it. It was once used to store dried vegetables during winter, but now it became the only safe place she could think of. She wrapped the little cub inside an old blanket and gently lowered him into the hidden space. Tears filled his bright eyes as he looked back at her. He did not understand why they had to hide again. Elara softly touched his tiny nose and whispered that she would come back soon. The cub stayed silent only because he trusted her completely. A loud knock suddenly shook the fragile door. Before Elara could answer, it burst open and two masked warriors stepped inside. Their sharp eyes searched every corner of the tiny room. One of them noticed the small fire while the other slowly walked closer to the bed. Elara forced herself to remain calm, though her heart pounded so loudly she feared they could hear it. If they discovered the cub beneath the floor, everything would be lost before the sun had even risen. One of the masked warriors stepped closer until he stood only a few feet away from the loose wooden boards. Elara felt every breath become heavier as fear tightened around her chest. Beneath the floor, the tiny cub struggled to remain silent. She could hear the faint sound of his nervous breathing and prayed that the strangers could not. Before the warrior reached the hidden place, Elara suddenly bent forward and began coughing hard. She held her stomach and stumbled against the wall as though a terrible sickness had taken hold of her. The sharp sound echoed through the tiny room. Both warriors stopped and looked at each other with clear disgust. One muttered that no healthy wolf would choose to stay near illness during the freezing season. Without another word, they turned away and walked toward the door. Elara remained still until their footsteps disappeared outside. Only then did she fall to her knees and lift the loose boards with shaking hands. The little white cub jumped into her arms and pressed his face against her neck. She hugged him tightly as tears filled her eyes. She whispered that everything was all right, though deep inside she knew the danger had not passed. The hunters had searched too carefully to give up so easily. Outside, the leader of the masked group paused beside Elara's doorway. His sharp eyes noticed several tiny white hairs caught between the rough wooden steps. He slowly picked one up and smiled beneath his hood. The scent matched the trail they had followed through the frozen forest. He quietly ordered his men to leave the village without causing suspicion. They would return after dark when no one would expect another search. Far away, King Kael stood upon a snowy cliff watching the endless wilderness below. Refusing to believe his son was gone forever, he swore that no storm, no enemy, and no kingdom would keep him from finding the child alive. The hunt had entered its most dangerous stage. Several quiet days passed after the first search, but Elara never allowed herself to relax. Every small sound outside made her glance toward the door. Every shadow between the trees reminded her that someone was still hunting the tiny white cub. Even so, life inside the little room slowly became warmer. Orion grew stronger with each sunrise. His playful spirit returned as he chased snowflakes drifting through the broken window and stumbled across the wooden floor with clumsy little paws. Whenever Elara smiled, he wagged his tail with excitement, as if her happiness was the greatest reward in the world. At night, he curled beside her and rested peacefully against her arm. The lonely silence that had filled her life for years slowly disappeared because she was no longer alone. Elara often spoke to him while preparing herbs or mending her torn clothes. She told him stories about bright spring flowers that would bloom after winter and clear rivers that sparkled beneath the morning sun. Orion listened with curious eyes, though he could not understand every word. Somehow her gentle voice always calmed him. When she laughed, he barked softly and tried to climb into her lap. Those simple moments became the happiest memories Elara had ever known. She forgot the cruel words of the pack and the endless days of loneliness whenever the little cub rested close to her heart. One cold evening, as darkness settled across the forest, Orion suddenly lifted his head and became completely still. His ears pointed toward the trees beyond the village, and the playful light vanished from his eyes. A low warning growl escaped his tiny throat. Elara had never heard him make that sound before. She looked outside but saw only falling snow and silent shadows. Then the village dogs began barking all at once, and distant voices echoed through the night. Someone had returned. The barking outside grew louder with every passing moment until frightened voices spread across the village. Elara quickly wrapped Orion inside her cloak and blew out the small fire. Darkness filled the tiny room as she listened carefully to the sounds beyond the walls. Heavy footsteps rushed through the snow while doors slammed open one after another. The masked hunters had returned exactly as she feared. This time they showed no patience. Angry shouts echoed through the cold air as they searched every home with growing desperation. Orion pressed himself tightly against Elara and his small body trembled. She gently stroked his soft fur and whispered that she would never leave him behind. Without wasting another second, Elara slipped through the broken window at the back of the shed. Snow reached almost to her knees, but she kept moving toward the forest. She knew narrow trails that few others remembered because she had gathered herbs there since childhood. The freezing wind cut across her face while branches scratched her hands, yet she never slowed down. Behind her, bright torchlight appeared between the trees as the hunters discovered her escape. One of them shouted that the girl was running with the white cub. The chase had begun. Hours passed before Elara finally reached a rocky hillside far from the village. She hid inside a small cave where Orion quietly rested against her chest. She looked back toward the distant lights of her home and understood she could never return. By sunrise, the pack would believe she had stolen something precious or betrayed them to strangers. Even those who had ignored her would gladly point toward the forest if anyone asked where she had gone. As the first pale light touched the snowy mountains, a messenger arrived at the village. The hall fell silent. Kael's eyes narrowed as hope returned for the first time since his son disappeared. If the child was alive, then someone had taken him away from the battlefield. Whether that person meant good or evil no longer mattered. The king ordered every royal warrior to ride north without delay. Meanwhile, Elara searched the frozen woods for anything they could eat. She gathered a few bitter berries hidden beneath the snow and found a small stream where the ice had begun to melt. She filled her hands with cold water before offering it to Orion first. Only after the little cub drank did she take a few careful sips herself. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but watching him regain strength gave her enough courage to keep walking. Unknown to her, the king himself was now following the same trail, only a few hours behind. By the second evening, Elara could barely keep moving through the endless forest. Her boots were torn and her feet ached with every step across the frozen ground. The cold had stolen the feeling from her fingers, and the little food she had gathered was already gone. Still, she refused to stop because Orion depended on her. Whenever the tiny cub looked up at her with trusting eyes, she found enough strength to take another step. She broke the last piece of dry bread into 2 small pieces, then quietly smiled as she placed the larger one in front of him. Orion ate happily before gently pushing part of it back toward her with his tiny nose. Even without words, the little cub wanted to share what he had. Not far behind them, King Kael rode across the snowy valley with his royal guards. Every village they visited told the same story. A poor young woman dressed in worn clothes had been seen carrying a small white wolf through the mountains. Some believed she had rescued the cub, while others whispered that she had stolen him from powerful enemies. Kael listened without showing emotion, but anger slowly burned inside him. If anyone had harmed his son, they would answer before the throne. Yet another thought quietly entered his mind. Why would a frightened village girl risk everything to keep a single cub alive unless there was another truth hidden beneath the rumors? As darkness covered the forest, Elara reached an old wooden bridge stretching across a deep, icy river. She stopped when Orion suddenly began growling toward the trees behind them. A cold wind carried the sound of approaching horses and clinking armor. Torches appeared between the snow-covered pines, growing brighter with every passing second. Elara took one slow breath and held Orion close against her heart. Without knowing who was coming, she stepped onto the narrow bridge while the hunters closed in from both sides. The moment they had been running from had finally arrived. Elara hurried across the old wooden bridge with Orion held tightly against her chest. The frozen boards groaned beneath her feet while icy water rushed far below. Behind her, the sound of horses grew louder until powerful voices echoed through the forest. She reached the other side and turned just as a group of heavily armored warriors surrounded the bridge from every direction. Their silver armor reflected the light of burning torches, and the symbol of the royal wolf shone proudly upon every shield. At the center of them all sat a tall man upon a black horse. His sharp silver eyes never left the tiny white cub in her arms. Even before anyone spoke, Elara felt the weight of his authority. This could only be the Alpha King. Kael slowly stepped down from his horse and walked toward her with calm confidence. Every warrior moved aside without question. His face showed no fear and no doubt, only cold determination. When he stopped a few steps away, his deep voice broke the silence. He ordered Elara to hand over the cub at once. His words were steady yet filled with the pain of a father searching for his lost child. Elara looked from the king to the soldiers surrounding her. She had no reason to trust strangers, no matter how noble they appeared. The hunters who chased them had also carried weapons and spoken with confidence. She tightened her arms around Orion and shook her head. Her voice trembled, but her courage did not. She said she would never give the little cub to anyone until she knew he would truly be safe. The royal warriors stared at her in disbelief. No Omega had ever dared refuse the command of the Alpha King. A heavy silence settled over the snowy bridge as everyone waited to see what would happen next. For a long moment no one moved. Snow drifted slowly through the cold air while the royal warriors watched the young Omega standing alone before the strongest Alpha King alive. Kael studied her face carefully. He expected fear or deceit, but instead he saw only exhaustion and quiet determination. Her hands were scratched and bleeding from days of travel. Her clothes were torn by branches and ice. She looked more like someone protecting a life than someone stealing one. Even so, he could not ignore the possibility that she had taken his son. His duty as both king and father demanded answers. Kael took one slow step forward and held out his hand. His voice remained calm as he promised that no harm would come to the cub if she trusted him. Before Elara could answer, Orion suddenly jumped from her arms. Every soldier relaxed, believing the little prince had finally recognized his father. Kael opened his arms, ready to embrace the child he had searched for across the kingdom. Hope filled every face around him. Then everything changed. Instead of running into the king's embrace, Orion raced past him without slowing down. The tiny white cub hurried back to Elara and hid behind her legs. He peeked around her with frightened eyes and refused to leave her side. Complete silence spread across the bridge. The royal guards stared in disbelief while Kael remained perfectly still. His own son had chosen the poor Omega over the most powerful Alpha in the world. Elara slowly placed herself between Orion and the soldiers without thinking about the danger. She lifted her chin and quietly said that the little cub was afraid and deserved kindness, not force. Kael looked at the fearless young woman with new eyes. For the first time since the search had begun, doubt entered his heart, and he wondered if the truth was far different from what he had believed. The journey to the royal capital began before sunrise. Elara rode inside a guarded carriage while Orion rested quietly beside her. Although no chains were placed on her wrists, the soldiers never allowed her out of their sight. They treated her with caution because no one knew whether she was a brave rescuer or a clever kidnapper. Orion refused to leave her lap during the entire journey. Whenever a guard reached toward him, he buried his face against her cloak and let out a frightened cry. The soldiers exchanged uneasy looks because the little prince trusted only the young Omega. Even King Kael watched this strange bond in thoughtful silence as they crossed snowy valleys toward the towering castle. When they finally reached the royal capital, thousands of wolves gathered outside the great hall after hearing that the missing heir had returned. Joy quickly turned into whispers when they saw an ordinary Omega walking beside the royal guards. Many believed she had stolen the prince. Others demanded punishment before any trial had even begun. Elara kept her head lowered as cruel words followed her through the crowd. She had faced hatred all her life, but never before from so many people at once. Still, she never let go of Orion. He looked around with wide, nervous eyes, then pressed himself closer to her side as if she were the only familiar thing left in the world. Inside the great hall, the royal council gathered beneath shining banners while King Kael took his place upon the throne. The room fell completely silent. Luna Selene stepped forward with a cold smile and pointed toward Elara. She declared that a common Omega had dared to steal the future king of the realm and demanded the harshest punishment without delay. Gasps filled the chamber as every eye turned toward the frightened young woman standing alone before the throne. Elara stood quietly before the throne while the voices around her grew louder with every passing moment. Members of the royal council argued among themselves, and many demanded that she be punished before the truth could be heard. Luna Selene smiled with quiet satisfaction as she watched the crowd turn against the frightened Omega. She spoke with confidence and claimed that no ordinary girl could have found the missing prince by chance. She insisted that Elara must have been working with the enemies of the crown from the very beginning. Every cruel accusation echoed through the great hall until even the servants lowered their heads in silence. King Kael listened without interrupting. His face remained calm, but his eyes never left Elara. He remembered the wounds on her hands and the exhaustion in her voice when she had stood on the bridge. Nothing about her had looked like a criminal, yet he still lacked proof. Before he could speak, two royal guards gently lifted Orion from Elara's arms, hoping to calm the frightened child. The little cub struggled at once. His cries filled the chamber as he reached desperately toward Elara. He kicked and twisted until one guard almost lost his balance. The entire hall watched in stunned silence. Instead of begging for her own freedom, Elara stepped forward with tears in her eyes and pleaded with the council to stop frightening the little prince. She quietly said they could accuse her of anything they wished but begged them not to make Orion suffer because of their anger. Her words carried no bitterness, only concern for the child she had protected. A heavy silence settled across the throne room. Kael slowly rose from his seat as doubt grew stronger within his heart. Before anyone could speak, another voice echoed from the entrance. An injured royal guard supported by two soldiers had arrived, claiming he knew exactly what had happened on the night the prince disappeared. The great hall became silent as every eye turned toward the entrance. The injured royal guard struggled to walk but refused to rest until he reached the center of the chamber. His armor was cracked and stained from old blood, and one arm remained wrapped in thick bandages. He knelt before King Kael and lowered his head with deep respect. The hall waited without a single whisper as the wounded soldier slowly raised his eyes. His voice was weak, but every word carried the weight of truth. He revealed that the attack on Prince Orion had not been the work of strangers from distant lands. It had been planned by traitors hiding within the kingdom itself. Shock spread through the council like a cold wind. The guard explained that he had been one of the royal escorts protecting the young prince during the journey. Hidden enemies suddenly attacked from every side, and many loyal warriors lost their lives defending the child. Before he fell unconscious, he saw trusted nobles giving secret orders to the assassins. They wanted the prince to disappear forever, so the throne could be controlled by those hungry for power. The guard had survived only because another soldier carried him away from the battlefield before the attackers returned. King Kael listened without moving while anger slowly filled his eyes. The hall remained silent as the wounded guard pointed toward several powerful nobles standing among the council. Fear crossed their faces for only a moment before they tried to deny every accusation. Then the guard spoke one final name that sent whispers through the entire chamber. He declared that Luna Selene had secretly met with the traitors before the attack and had promised them a reward once the young. Several nobles quickly agreed with her, hoping to save themselves from suspicion. For a brief moment, confusion spread through the great hall once again. Elara remained silent, holding Orion close, while the little cub watched Luna with growing fear. His small body trembled and he buried his face against Elara's shoulder, as if remembering something too painful to understand. Before Luna could continue, another royal captain entered the chamber carrying a sealed wooden chest recovered from the battlefield. He knelt before King Kael and carefully opened the lid. Inside rested secret letters marked with the private seals of the traitorous nobles. Hidden among them was a golden bracelet that belonged only to Luna Selene. The captain explained that the bracelet had been found beside the place where the assassins gathered before attacking the prince. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Gasps filled the hall as the council members stared at the shining bracelet lying beside the letters. Luna's eyes widened with panic for the first time. She stepped backward and searched for someone willing to defend her, but no voice answered. The nobles who had supported her moments earlier lowered their heads and slowly moved away. King Kael rose from his throne with a calm expression that frightened everyone far more than anger ever could. His voice echoed across the hall as he ordered the royal guards to arrest every person whose name appeared inside the letters. As soldiers surrounded the traitors, Luna suddenly pulled a hidden dagger from her sleeve and rushed toward Orion with desperate determination. Everything happened in a single heartbeat. Luna rushed forward with the hidden dagger raised high while terrified voices echoed through the great hall. The royal guards reached for their swords, but they were a moment too late. Orion stood frozen beside Elara, unable to understand the danger racing toward him. Without thinking about herself, Elara threw her body in front of the tiny prince. She wrapped both arms around him and turned so her own back faced the attack. The sharp blade struck her shoulder before sliding across her side. Pain rushed through her body, but she never loosened her hold on Orion. The little cub cried out in fear and buried his face against her as warm blood stained her torn cloak. The hall exploded into chaos. Guards surrounded Luna while frightened nobles stumbled away from the fighting. King Kael moved with terrifying speed. In a single motion he crossed the distance between the throne and the attackers. His sword flashed through the air, knocking the dagger from Luna's hand before she could strike again. His silver eyes burned with a fury no one had ever witnessed. Every warrior in the chamber froze because they knew the Alpha King was no longer fighting as a ruler. He was fighting as a father who had nearly lost his child for the second time. Kael quickly knelt beside Elara as she struggled to remain awake. Orion refused to leave her side and cried softly while pressing against her injured shoulder. Elara forced a weak smile and gently stroked the little cub with trembling fingers. She whispered that he was safe now, and that was all that mattered. Hearing those words, Kael realized she had risked her life without hesitation for a child who was never her own. In that moment, every remaining doubt inside his heart disappeared forever. Royal healers rushed into the great hall carrying blankets, clean cloth, and healing herbs. They gently lifted Elara from the cold stone floor while Orion cried and struggled to follow her. No matter how carefully the guards tried to comfort him, he pulled away from every hand except hers. King Kael quietly picked up his frightened son and held him close for the first time since the prince had disappeared. Orion rested against his father only for a moment before reaching toward Elara again. Kael looked down at the little cub, then toward the wounded Omega being carried away. At that moment he understood why his son trusted her more than anyone else. She had become the safe place Orion believed he would never lose. The palace remained locked as royal warriors searched every hallway for hidden enemies. The remaining traitors were captured before they could escape, while Luna Celine was placed under heavy guard to await judgment. No one dared speak in defense of the woman who had tried to murder the future king before the entire court. The nobles who once praised her now stood in complete silence with shame written across their faces. Justice had begun, but Kael found no satisfaction in their defeat because his thoughts remained with the young woman fighting for her life. As the healers disappeared into the royal chambers, Kael stood outside the doors refusing to leave. Hours passed while snow quietly covered the palace gardens beyond the windows. Every time the doors opened, his heart tightened, hoping for good news. At last, an elderly healer stepped into the hallway with a tired expression. She bowed respectfully before the king and admitted that Elara had lost much blood. The next few hours would decide whether she lived or died. Kael slowly closed his eyes and made a silent promise that if fate spared the brave Omega, he would never again allow anyone to bring harm to the woman who had saved both his son and his kingdom. Night settled quietly over the royal palace as snow drifted beyond the tall windows. The long hallway outside the healing chamber remained silent except for the soft crackle of burning torches. King Kael stood beside the closed door without moving. His royal advisors begged him to rest, but he ignored every request. The strongest alpha in the kingdom had faced countless battles without fear, yet now he felt powerless before a single wooden door. Inside that room, the young Omega who had saved his son was fighting for her life. Every passing moment seemed longer than the last. Orion refused to leave the hallway. The tiny white cub lay beside the door with his head resting upon his paws. He had not eaten since Elara was carried away. Servants brought warm milk and fresh meat, but he turned away from every meal. His bright eyes remained fixed on the healing chamber as if he believed Elara would appear at any moment. Seeing his son so heartbroken filled Kael with quiet sorrow. He knelt beside Orion and gently stroked his soft white fur. The little cub looked up for a moment, then rested against his father before turning back toward the door. Even without words, Kael understood exactly what the child was asking. They both wanted only one thing. They wanted Elara to wake. As dawn slowly approached, the doors finally opened. The elderly healer stepped into the hallway with tired eyes and stained hands. She smiled faintly before bowing to the king. She explained that the wound had been deep, but the danger had passed. Elara would survive, though she would need time to recover. Relief washed across Kael's face for the first time in many years. Orion let out a joyful cry and hurried into the room before anyone could stop him, while the king quietly followed behind, carrying hope instead of fear. Soft morning light filled the healing chamber as Elara slowly opened her eyes. Everything around her felt quiet and distant. For a moment she could not remember where she was or why her shoulder ached so deeply. Then she felt something warm resting beside her hand. She looked down and found Orion sleeping peacefully with his tiny paw placed gently across her fingers. A small smile appeared on her face as she carefully brushed the soft fur upon his head. The little cub opened his eyes at once and let out a happy cry before climbing carefully onto the bed. He pressed his face against her without leaving her side for even a moment. The sound brought King Kael into the room. He had remained nearby ever since the healers declared she would live. When his eyes met hers, he stopped for a moment as though searching for the right words. The proud Alpha King who ruled countless wolves lowered his head with quiet respect. He thanked Elara for saving his son not once but twice. His voice remained calm yet carried deep sincerity. He admitted that he had judged her unfairly when they first met and asked her forgiveness. Elara gently shook her head and said that protecting Orion had never felt like a burden because every child deserved kindness no matter where they were born. Kael looked at the young Omega with growing admiration. Strength did not always come from sharp claws or great power. Sometimes it came from a gentle heart willing to stand before danger for someone who could not protect themselves. In that peaceful room he made a silent promise that no one would ever call Elara worthless again. Beyond the palace windows, the first clear sky after many days of snow stretched across the kingdom, as though even the world itself welcomed the beginning of a new future. Several days later, the great royal courtyard filled with wolves from every corner of the kingdom. Leaders, elders, warriors, and ordinary families gathered beneath bright banners to witness the largest council meeting in many years. News of the conspiracy had spread across every pack, and everyone wanted to hear the truth from the Alpha King himself. Snow still covered the palace grounds, but the morning sky was clear and filled with light. Elara stood quietly beside Orion, wearing a simple blue dress provided by the royal servants. Though her shoulder was still healing, she refused to hide from the people. She had spent her whole life running from cruel words, and she would not run anymore. King Kael stepped onto the great stone platform before the crowd. Silence spread across the courtyard as his powerful voice carried through the cold air. He revealed every part of the conspiracy, from the attack upon the prince to the betrayal hidden inside the royal council. One by one the guilty nobles were brought forward in chains. Their titles, lands, and honors were stripped away before the eyes of the kingdom. No amount of wealth or power could protect those who had betrayed the crown. The people watched with shock as men once respected by every pack stood defeated by their own greed. At last Luna Selene was led into the courtyard under heavy guard. Her proud smile had vanished and fear now filled her eyes. She looked toward the crowd hoping someone would defend her, but every face remained silent. King Kael declared that she had chosen ambition over loyalty, and had endangered the future of the kingdom for her own desires. As the people waited for judgment, every eye slowly turned toward Elara because everyone knew the brave Omega had become the heart of the story that changed them all. The royal courtyard remained silent as King Kael asked Elara to step forward. Thousands of eyes followed her while whispers moved through the crowd. Only a few weeks earlier she had been a forgotten Omega with no place in the world. Now she stood beside the Alpha King before the entire kingdom. Luna Selene looked at her with bitterness, expecting words of anger or revenge. Many people believed Elara would demand the harshest punishment after everything she had suffered. Instead she took a slow breath and quietly lifted her eyes toward the king. Elara spoke with gentle honesty. She said that those who planned the betrayal should answer for their crimes because justice protected every innocent family in the kingdom. Yet she also asked that the children and loved ones of the guilty should not suffer for mistakes they had never made. Her kind words surprised everyone gathered in the courtyard. Even those who once doubted her lowered their heads with respect. She had every reason to hate, but she chose compassion instead. At that moment the people understood that true strength did not come from fear or power. It came from a heart that refused to become cruel even after facing great pain. King Kael looked across the silent crowd before turning toward Elara. Pride and admiration filled his eyes as he declared that courage without kindness was empty, and kindness without courage could never change the world. He announced before every pack that the brave Omega who had saved the royal heir would forever be honored as the heart of the kingdom. Thunderous cheers rose across the courtyard while Orion happily ran into Elara's arms. As joy filled the palace grounds, Kael stepped closer with one final announcement still waiting upon his lips, and every voice slowly fell silent once again. The cheers slowly faded as King Kael stepped to the center of the royal platform. A peaceful silence settled across the courtyard while thousands of wolves waited to hear his final words. The winter sun shone brightly over the palace, and soft snow sparkled like silver across the stone walls. Kael looked first at Orion, then at Elara. His usually calm face carried a warmth that very few people had ever seen. He spoke about the lonely Omega who had expected nothing from the world, yet had given everything to protect a helpless child. He reminded every pack that courage was not measured by rank or strength, but by the choices made when no one was watching. Many warriors lowered their heads because they knew the young woman before them had shown greater honor than those who had once called themselves heroes. Kael slowly walked toward Elara until only a single step separated them. Before the entire kingdom, he lowered himself onto one knee. A wave of surprise swept through the crowd because no Alpha King had ever knelt before an Omega. Elara stood frozen, unable to believe what she was seeing. Kael looked into her eyes and thanked her for saving not only his son but also the hope inside his own heart. He admitted that before meeting her he believed power alone could protect a kingdom. Now he understood that compassion was the greatest strength of all. Orion happily ran between them carrying a beautiful silver pendant marked with the ancient royal crest. Holding it carefully in his tiny paws, he looked up at Elara with shining eyes. The little cub gently placed the pendant into her hands and smiled with innocent happiness, as though he had been waiting for this moment since the day she rescued him from beneath the frozen river. Elara looked down at the silver pendant resting in her hands while tears slowly filled her eyes. She remembered the lonely nights inside the cold storage room and the cruel voices that had told her she would never matter. She remembered the freezing river, the bleeding hands, and the tiny white cub she had refused to abandon. Never once had she imagined that a single act of kindness would change the fate of an entire kingdom. Orion looked up at her with endless trust, then wrapped his little paws around her arm. In a soft, innocent voice he called her mother for the very first time. The simple word touched every heart gathered in the royal courtyard. Many warriors quietly wiped away tears while smiles spread through the crowd. King Kael gently offered Elara his hand without demanding an answer. He told her that destiny should never be forced, and that the choice would always belong to her alone. Elara looked at Orion, then back at the king. She saw not the feared ruler spoken of in distant lands, but a father who had learned the value of compassion, and a man who respected her heart more than her rank. With quiet confidence she placed her hand in his. Joy swept through the kingdom as cheers echoed across the snowy mountains and royal banners danced proudly in the winter wind. As soft snow began falling once more, the royal family stood together looking toward a brighter future. The forgotten Omega had become the future Luna of the strongest kingdom, not because of power or noble blood, but because she chose kindness when the world offered her cruelty. The kingdom entered a new age built upon justice, courage, and hope. And far beyond the distant mountains where the last shadows of winter disappeared, a new dawn promised that their greatest adventures were only just beginning.